Warning, this episode contains references to violence. Please use discretion when listening. How do you end a war? This was the question on everyone's mind in 1989. For almost a decade, El Salvador was steeped in a devastating war. Both sides, the military and the FMLN, were convinced that with one final push, their side could win. Meanwhile, the country that they fought for was in shambles. The economy was worse off than before. A quarter of the population had left, and tens of thousands lay dead. It was a battle to rule over the ashes. To Father Ignacio Ellacuría, the only answer was a negotiated ceasefire.
Mi tesis principal aquí en Estados Unidos es decir que Estados Unidos no ha encontrado la solución del Salvador.
Father Ellacuría was a Jesuit priest and philosopher who taught at the University of Central America in San Salvador. We call it La UCA. He'd spent that war documenting the truth, contradicting the lies of the government, and teaching the next generation of young people at the university. People like Hector Lindo Fuentes.
Being educated by the Jesuits kind of helped to open my mind to many things that would not have been possible to even to see or to hear about in other places.
Professor Hector Lindo Fuentes is now retired, but he spent his entire career teaching Latin American studies, most recently at Fordham University. He grew up in El Salvador and studied under his then professor, Father Ellacuría.
He was not a big guy. He was not particularly slender, but he was by no means an imposing person in the physical aspect. But intellectually, he was really a giant. He was a very brilliant and incisive mind.
Father Ellacuría's brilliant and incisive mind made him a giant both on and off campus. He was the rector of the university, the leader among all the other Jesuits, and a published author who traveled the world giving lectures and conferences. And it was his brilliant mind that made him the perfect negotiator. Just like Archbishop Romero before him, Ellacuría was meeting with high-ranking officials on both sides of the war, trying to create a dialogue between them. This included talks with then-President Alfredo Cristiani.
After winning the election, but before going into office, I had a few talks with Father Ellacuría and asked him to go meet with the Comandante to say, how would they look at this?
That's Cristiani in an interview with Duke University. As you can hear, he spoke perfect English. Cristiani was an old-school oligarch, a businessman who studied at Georgetown and had family ties to the coffee industry. And President Cristiani could see that the war wasn't just hurting the poor. The rich were losing out too. Production was down. The FMLN were blowing up bridges and specifically targeting the oligarchy and their ability to profit off the country. And at this point, the FMLN was receiving financial and military support from communist allies in Cuba and Russia, further complicating an already complex international relationship. Cristiani wanted a way out, and he basically had Father Ellacuría on speed dial.
He was kind of a go-between, and he was really interested in promoting the idea of a negotiated solution.
Father Ellacuría and Cristiani were working together, trying to find a way to end this terrible war, which is why it was so shocking that on the night of November 15th, 1989, just hours after a phone call with the president, Father Ellacuría was murdered.
They were shot in the brain.
Ellacuría, along with 5 other Jesuit priests, their housekeeper, and her daughter, were murdered. Their bodies were dragged out onto the campus lawn, displayed for everyone to see. 1989 was the beginning of the end of the Civil War. And if Oscar Romero's murder was the catalyst to start it, Father Ellacuría and the Jesuit murders were the catalyst to end it. The Jesuit massacre would send shockwaves through El Salvador and beyond. And the question of who gave the order and who knew would get at the heart of who really held the power in El Salvador. I'm Jasmine Romero, and this is Sacred Scandal, Nation of Saints. Episode 8, The Jesuits. We'll be right back after the break.
Jasmine, I'm trying to make your patience worthwhile because you spent so much time chasing me down.
You were very well worth it.
I'm trying to make it well worth it.
That's Professor Terry Carl. I could read you her bona fides, but it would basically take up the entire podcast.
I'm an emeritus professor from Stanford University. I was a professor at Harvard before then.
Professor Carl was the expert witness for cases on El Mozote, Oscar Romero's assassination, and the murder of the Jesuits, just to name a few. She is, by far, the foremost American expert on El Salvador. But she's not just an academic. She was also on the ground throughout the entire war, getting information that no one else was getting.
I'm small. I was female, brown-haired, kind of cute, I think. And I was not a journalist. So I could go around and ask questions and find things that journalists really had a harder time on because people were afraid that they would be quoted.
Including doing things like spending 3 weeks on the campaign trail with Roberto D'Aubuisson.
It's quite an intimidating guy, and especially if you knew that he had already killed people, which I did.
She later used her insights on D'Aubuisson to give testimony at the trial for Oscar Romero's murder. So, yeah, Professor Carl is the real deal. And in the late 1980s, Professor Carl was working on an academic project.
So I was at that point trying to map out violence. And I had all these undergraduates putting little yellow and red and pink and different color pins in a map.
She was constantly flying back and forth, collecting information on the ground in El Salvador and bringing it back to the U.S. to analyze. And one of the places that she was getting a lot of her information was from the Jesuits at La UCA.
Every time I would come to El Salvador, which was quite a lot at that time, I just kept checking in with them. And then eventually, when I moved to Stanford, I formed a work group with Nacho's help and Ellacuría's help.
Now, Father Ellacuría is probably the most important person in this story. But before we get into him, I want to take a second to talk about the other Jesuit priests that he was working with. I kind of think of the Jesuits at La UCA like the Ninja Turtles. Stay with me. Just like the Ninja Turtles, each one of the Jesuit priests working at La UCA had a specialty, something that they were uniquely talented at. Take Father Ignacio Martín Baró, who Professor Carl affectionately calls Nacho. Martín Baró was an incredible psychologist. His focus was on understanding what the war was doing to the psyche of the Salvadoran people. He'd traveled all over the world, giving lectures about his theory on the militarization of the mind. The idea that living under violence for so long was fundamentally changing Salvadorans, creating a society that could only use violence to solve its problems. Here he is at a lecture at San Francisco State.
La vida no vale nada en El Salvador. Life is worth nothing in El Salvador or in Guatemala. The law of the strongest, I'd rather say the most violent, is a social criterion. And corruption as a lifestyle, thus precipitating a vicious circle which tends to perpetuate the war.
And then there's Father Segundo Montes, an incredible speaker who was studying the impacts of the refugee crisis that the war was creating.
Segundo Montes could relate to anybody, any peasant. I mean, you just got him out there and he was just, people loved him. They loved him. And they would mob him.
Father Joaquin Lopez y Lopez founded schools for poor children. Father Juan Ramon Moreno took care of the libraries and was a meticulous cataloger of information. And Father Lopez Quintanilla was an expert gardener who took care of Lauca's mango trees. For the record, Professor Carl agreed with my Ninja Turtles analogy.
You're absolutely right. They were really admired and loved for their particular ability.
And as we know, the Ninja Turtles are led by an anthropomorphic rat sensei named Master Splinter. And the Master Splinter in this scenario is, of course, Father Ignacio Ellacuría.
Ellacuría was very patrician. He just reminded me of a Spanish patrician of the Middle Ages or something. The way he carried himself, the way he looked, the way, he was an extraordinary mind.
Very Master Splinter. So Father Ellacuría is leading the Jesuits at the university and doing his academic work. But on the side,
what he's doing shuffle diplomacy. That's what he's doing. He's the guy who's back and forth, talking to this, but he's the only one that the comandantes on the FMLN will talk to, but so will Cristiani. And he's making progress because all kinds of people who said we're not going to negotiate start saying, well, you're right. There's too much death. There's too much killing. There's too much this. There's too much that.
Which seems like a good thing, right? I mean, who wants more war? President Cristiani was definitely on board. And so was the U.S., who at this point had spent the last 9 years shoveling money into a war that would not end. Well, some people were extremely unhappy that Ellacuría was trying to end the war.
We call them spoilers in the negotiating business, if I can put it that way, because they're the ones who are going to do something to spoil any chance of peace.
On the left, you've got the extremists in the FMLN. The ones that are convinced that normal civilians, if just given the chance, will revolt against the government. And on the right, you've got La Tandona.
The biggest graduating class, 1966, the so-called Tandona, graduating class in the military has taken power. Now, they are the hardest of the hardline. They're not a big number, because remember, officers are the elite. They're not a big number. They're making money hand over fist.
La Tandona is a group of colonels who all graduated the Salvadoran Military Academy together in the class of 66. And they're the highest-ranking officers in the Salvadoran military. The Minister of Defense, the Chief of Staff, the head of the Air Force. They're the ones calling the shots and getting rich off of the military aid from the U.S.
They're not just committing human rights abuses, but they're all in business. And they're trafficking. And there's, people are selling visas. Everything is up for sale.
Selling arms. Taking the salaries of dead soldiers. The coronels of La Tandona had all kinds of schemes that they were running to profit off of the hundreds of millions that the U.S. was sending over. And they were in no rush to end the war and give all that up. Meanwhile, you've got Father Ellacuría
getting back and forth and go back and forth and back and forth. Now, if you're to the Tandona, your biggest threat is Ellacuría.
And it wasn't just La Tandona who had a bone to pick. The Jesuits had also made enemies of the oligarchy, those famed 14 families.
The only word I kept hearing was traición, traición, traición. Traitors, traitors, traitors. And I'd say, would you explain to me what that means? And it means, we used to be able to send our kids here. We didn't have to send our kids to the United States. We believed in the UCA as a very good education. Now we can't do that anymore because they come back and they say, I think you should pay the peasants more. And the whole thing was, you're traitors to us. And the anger was really at the Jesuits, and it was really at Ellacuría being the rector.
In the days leading up to the massacre, Salvadoran call-in radio shows were filled with people calling for the Jesuits to be thrown out, to be jailed, to be killed, saying that they were traitors to the country or that they were the real leaders of the FMLN. But Father Ellacuría still believes that there's a chance for peace. He believes in President Cristiani, that with Cristiani's help, they'll find a way forward. In mid-November of 1989, Ellacuría went to Spain to give a lecture. But while he was gone, things escalated between the left and the right in El Salvador. So President Cristiani calls him and tells him, "You need to come home. I need your help to calm things down."
Everybody warned Ellacuría not to come back. Everybody who knew him. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't trust this. It wasn't really about trusting Cristiani per se. Just don't even trust this, right? So he decides to come back. When he gets back, a number of people, including me, said, "You have to get out of the UCA, they're going to kill you." By this point, I had gotten to be quite an expert in anticipating killings. And I'm being able to smell the crescendo, you know.
Did you call him?
Not him. I didn't call Ellacuría, I got somebody else. And I said, "They're going to kill you." And I went to the president of Stanford and I said, "You've got to help me. I know these intellectuals are the rector, the vice rector, blah, blah, and they're going to kill him. And I got to get him out of there."
The next morning, Professor Carl heard that there'd been a massacre at La UCA. Around 2:30 a.m., the Atlacatl Battalion, the same one that committed the massacre in El Mozote, broke into the Jesuits' sleeping quarters. I've been there. The rooms are Spartan, just 4 walls of concrete. Some of them are shot in bed. Others are dragged out onto the lawn and shot there. A witness heard Father Martín Baró shout, "Esto es una injusticia." This is an injustice. They also found Elba Ramos, the Jesuits' housekeeper, hiding in her room along with her 15-year-old daughter, Selena. They were both shot and killed as well. The soldiers then fired a couple of shots into the walls and put a flamethrower to the Jesuits' rooms to create the impression of a shootout. The news made headlines around the world.
6 Jesuit priests were brutally executed in San Salvador last week. Their deaths have triggered a heated congressional debate on continuation of military aid to that country. Even President Bush has been dogged on the road by repeated protests and questions about United States policy.
Let me just say a word about El Salvador. Maybe it'll help. It was the FMLN, the Marxist-Leninist FMLN, that shot its way into the middle of El Salvador, trying to disrupt Salvador's democracy. And President Cristiani told me on the phone that they will do everything they can to bring to justice, whether they're from the right or the left, those who wantonly murdered those priests.
Right away, the reaction was, this is not going to stand. This is not going to stand.
After the break, a Boston brawler, a failed cover-up, and finally, an end to the war.
And it seems to me that it is incumbent on us to guarantee that if we're going to put $1 million a day somewhere, that $1 million is going to live up to our standards. And if it can't live up to our standards, then we shouldn't be putting it there, no matter what the outcome.
Well, I don't.
Now, I listen here
I hope
to
that isn't what you believe, no matter what the outcome.
Then you get back into the question of.
That's a snippet of a Senate hearing from the weeks after the Jesuit massacre. In the hearing, then Senator John Kerry is questioning whether the U.S. should continue sending military aid to El Salvador in light of the news. Bernard Aronson, the Assistant Secretary from the Department of State, argues that pulling the military aid will just make the situation worse. Mind you, this is now 10 years into the war. 10 years. In those 10 years, never, not once, was the military aid that was sent to El Salvador met with any kind of restrictions or demands. It was literally free money that the U.S. sent to the Salvadoran military. And it had been 10 years of these kinds of debates. But if it were to be discovered that the murdered Jesuit priests were in fact killed by the Salvadoran military, well, that might finally change the story.
All the times the United States shook its finger at El Salvador's military and said, now, if you do that one more time, we're going to cut off aid. It didn't have any meaning, but this time it did. And that's what was so important, is that this time it did.
The Jesuits weren't just small-town priests like Oscar Romero. They weren't nameless civilians in El Mozote. These were the Ninja Turtles. They'd given speeches at Berkeley. They'd met senators and heads of state. These guys were well-connected and well-respected scholars. It wouldn't be so easy to just write these guys off as communists. In the immediate aftermath of the Jesuit massacre, the Salvadoran government would claim that the FMLN was responsible for the attack. And President Cristiani announced that he would conduct a thorough investigation of the same old story. Lie and deny. But with U.S. attitudes rapidly shifting on El Salvador, this time would be different. Partially because of a congressman from Boston named Joe Moakley.
Moakley. Let me tell you about Moakley. Moakley, great Irish Catholic. Moakley was a street fighter, and he had been appointed by the Congress to have a fact-finding commission on who killed the Jesuits.
I have to admit, I really wasn't sure exactly where El Salvador was. I didn't know whether it was Central America or South America.
A hard-talking brawler from Boston, Congressman Moakley had long been critical of the U.S.'s involvement in El Salvador. And so the Moakley Commission goes down to El Salvador with a couple of investigators, determined to find out exactly what happened to these Jesuit priests, barging into meetings and talking to high and low-ranking officials, asking a lot of questions.
Moakley was like a bulldog. He wouldn't stop. You couldn't stop him.
And Moakley can see that the Salvadorans aren't being totally honest about what happened. They're sending him on fake leads or outright lying. But he can put two and two together. He's looking at the evidence and saying, if the military had complete control of the university on the night of the murders, how could the FMLN be the ones that killed the priests? Moakley and his team start sniffing dangerously close to the truth. And if the truth gets out, well, there goes all that American cash. But La Tandona, that cohort of colonels that's running the military, they have a plan in place just for this kind of problem. In the days leading up to the Jesuit massacre, there was a series of closed-door meetings. Meetings where they decide exactly when and how the Jesuits will be killed. And they decide that, just in case anything goes wrong, they're gonna need a fall guy. They land on the director of the military academy, Coronel Guillermo Benavides.
Now, the thing about Colonel Benavides that's so important in this cover-up story is that Benavides would never have come up with this idea by himself. Never.
Coronel Guillermo Benavides was part of La Tandona, but he's sort of the black sheep of the group. He's the guy that everyone keeps around because, well, he's part of the group. But he's not out there making policy decisions or running operations. He's running the military school. It's a relatively low-level position for a man of his rank. 2 days before the Jesuit massacre, the Atlacatl Battalion was transferred to Benavides' command. And on the night of November 15th, he's given an order to take care of the Jesuit problem. And he does.
So he didn't realize at the time that he was being set up to be the fall guy?
Oh, I don't think so. I don't think it would have ever occurred to any member of the Tandona that they could be a fall guy.
Once Moakley came sniffing around, Benavides was presented as the sole intellectual author of the killings. Now, to be clear, Benavides was given an order by a superior officer, a member of La Tandona, but he never testified as to who gave him that order.
So why doesn't he talk? Why doesn't he say, I didn't do this? I'll tell you why. Because Colonel Montano threatened his family.
Coronel Montano, the Minister of Security and member of La Tandona's inner circle.
It's a mafia organization, the Tandoni. It's like, we know where you live. We know where your son goes to school.
Benavides, along with 8 other low-ranking military officers, are arrested for the murder of the Jesuits. The Salvadoran government quickly pushes the case through and finds Benavides and 1 other guy guilty. It's a farce. Quote, a kangaroo court to make kangaroos blush, in the words of a U.S. Court of Appeals judge who reviewed the case. But La Tandona figures, hey, we tossed them Benavides. Now everything should go back to normal. But it's too late. Congressman Moakley has seen how these guys operate. He goes back to Washington and tells everyone how, quote, the American people and Congress have been played for fools.
I still encounter members of the armed forces who fail to demonstrate any remorse or any regret over the assassination of the Jesuits. Mr. Chairman, they don't even fake it very well. I cannot think of one single instance where one single member of the Salvadoran Armed Forces has openly and voluntarily provided any evidence of any significance that has helped move this case forward.
6 months after the Jesuit massacre, Moakley passed a bill to cut aid to El Salvador by 50%. The Salvadoran military, seeing their cash cow is drying up, finally comes to the table to negotiate an end to the war. But what about President Cristiani? I mean, he's the president, after all, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And he'd been on the phone with Father Ellacuría just hours before the murders. From the very beginning, Cristiani has claimed that he did not know about the plot to murder the Jesuits, that this was strictly a military operation. But Professor Carl has her doubts.
I'm pretty sure Cristiani must have known, but I don't know that for a fact, and only he can tell us that. And maybe they didn't confide in him because they didn't trust him, because he was with, I don't know that. There are other colonels who say he knew. There are people who said he knew, and they're all dead. They've all been murdered. Every single one of them.
In the years since the Jesuit murders, Cristiani has been accused multiple times of being a co-conspirator. But it's never been proven in court. There's currently a warrant out for his arrest in El Salvador. His whereabouts are unknown. After 2 long years of negotiations, in 1992, the FMLN and the Salvadoran government finally agreed to the Chapultepec Accords, the official end to the Salvadoran Civil War. The murder of the Jesuits is largely regarded as the event that finally broke open talks. And President Cristiani was hailed as the man who ended the war.
En estos momentos estamos viendo al presidente de la República fuera de protocolo saludando a la delegación del Frente Farabundo Martí para la...
As part of the agreement, the FMLN turned into an official political party and even won seats in the Legislative Assembly. Parts of the Salvadoran military were disbanded and a new, more impartial judicial system was implemented. But to me, the most important thing that comes out of those negotiations is the UN Truth Commission. In an attempt to heal the country, the UN sent investigators in to uncover all of the human rights abuses and finally bring those responsible to justice. And if they had, that might be where our story ends. But
everything's falling apart because the Truth Commission is naming names.
The UN Truth Commission starts to uncover everything. The perpetrators of all of these crimes. They named Dawison the intellectual author of Oscar Romero's murder. They uncover the chain of command for the Jesuit massacre, directly naming officers in La Tandona. And they find the bodies in El Mozote. And it's not just the Salvadoran military being named. The investigators also uncover abuses committed by the FMLN. All these retired military captains, who are now politicians and in the Legislative Assembly, realize that they're going to be sent to jail for the things that they did during the war. So, of course,
the Arena-dominated Congress passes a self-amnesty.
Total amnesty. The Salvadoran legislature passes a law that declares that no matter what you did during the war, you won't be punished for it.
There are FMLN commanders who went quite along with this, partly because they also are guilty of human rights violations, some of these commanders.
Members of the FMLN, who are now part of the Salvadoran government, also voted to pass this sweeping amnesty law that left everyone impune.
Anybody who committed a human rights crime in one of the armed forces or in the death squads or something probably was pretty okay. Was okay.
The Cold War is over. The U.S. pulls its funding, and all the killers go free. And just like that, it's as if none of it had ever happened at all. So what happens to the people of El Salvador? What becomes of a person when you can see your rapist at the grocery store, or when your mother's killer becomes a senator? When your pain and your suffering is unacknowledged, and the guilty go free. Professor Carl read me a quote by a judge who oversaw the Nuremberg trials after World War II. Trials where the Nazis were condemned.
If you were to say that these men are not guilty, it would be as true to say there had been no war, there were no victims, and there had been no crime. In El Salvador, there was a war, there were victims, and there has been a crime.
75,000 dead, 1 million more displaced, and no hope of justice. The peace accords did end the war, but they also left a giant wound exposed. A population left with the trauma of war. And in the words of Father Martín Baró, a society with a militarized mind.
And what I would say is if you do that down the road, you will have another iteration. Not the same way, not necessarily two armed forces, not with the ideology involved, but you will have another iteration down the road, whether it's 20 years or 30 years or 40 years, of the same kind of violence, except worse.
El Salvador has one of the highest murder rates in the world. Rival gangs like MS-13 and 18th Street have been at war for decades. They work like the mafia, extorting money from local businesses, fighting for territory, and killing with impunity.
That's next time on Nation of Saints. Sacred Scandal, Nation of Saints is a production of AHA Podcasts in partnership with iHeart's My Cultura podcast network and is hosted and written by me, Jasmine Romero. Produced by Jasmine Romero with help from Álvaro Céspedes. Research and reporting by Jasmine Romero. Edited by Zaire Quevedo. Nation of Saints was recorded in New York City at the Relic Room with engineering by Brett Tugin. Mixing and sound design by Pachi Quiñones. Original music by Golden Minds, Darko and Ayeme, based on Patrick Hart's original composition. Fact-checking by Erendira Aquino Ayala. Executive producers are Carmen Graterol, Isaac Lee, Rose Reed, and Nando Villa. Our executive producers at iHeart are Giselle Bances and Arlene Santana. Sacred Scandal was created by Melanie Bartley and Paula Barros. For more podcasts, go to the iHeartRadio app or anywhere you listen to your favorite podcasts.